So, following a recent survey on my community tab on my YouTube channel, it seems that quite a few of you want to have some more war movie reviews. Well, I'm not going to disappoint. So I'm going to kick that off with a film that I really like, A Bridge Too Far. Made in 1977 and directed by Sir Richard Attenborough, A Bridge Too Far explores the real-life battle of Operation Market Garden, Montgomery's plan to get the Allies into Germany via the Norman route and thereby force the Germans to surrender by the end of 1944. The plot itself is pretty straightforward and it sticks to the facts pretty accurately. Basically, the plan is to carry out the largest airborne assault ever conceived, whereby Allied paratroops would be dropped at key locations in occupied Holland, capturing some key bridges, namely those of Eindhoven, the Somme, Nijmegen, Grave and Arnhem, allowing for 30 Corps, the armoured division commanded by General Horrocks, to push through the German lines and linking up with the airborne troops on the way and thus securing a route into Germany over the Rhine. However, in real life, the plan was conceived with a little bit more than just capturing a few bridges to get into the Rhine, and one of the most important aspects of the operation was to actually find and destroy the V2 rocket sites that were situated around The Hague, which is something this film fails to mention. It was due to these V2 sites that Market Garden was actually expanded. Initially it was called Operation Comet, a much smaller assault, in a similar vein to that of Market Garden, but not as grand. The film itself starts with a brief overview of the plan via a narration. It then flips to occupied Holland. Here we see the German armed forces in total disarray as they retreat from France, following the breakout of the Allied forces after D-Day. We are then shown the German High Command for the area under the new leadership of von Rundstedt, moving troops into Holland, especially around Arnhem, for rest and recuperation. It is completely correct that Beatrix's 2nd SS Panzer Corps was indeed moved to Arnhem, but it was also moved to Eindhoven. It's kind of split for rest and refit, after that division had been badly mauled in the Battle of the Falaise Pocket. However, one thing the film fails to address is that von Rundstedt and Mogul had actually decided to put up a resistance to stop the Allied advance in any event, and they were basically bolstering the German forces for that very reason. Although they had not anticipated any type of airborne assault, especially around the Arnhem area, instead considering that a typical advance would come where somewhere near Antwerp and or Maastricht. We then move to England, where the overall leadership of the operation itself rests with General Browning, played here brilliantly by Dirk Bogarde. The planning itself follows the real-life situation, whereby the US 101st Airborne, commanded by General Maxwell Taylor, is given the task of capturing Eindhoven and the Somme. The US 82nd, under General Gavin, here played by Ryan O'Neill, is tasked with the Grave and Nijmegen bridges, and the British 1st Airborne, under the command of General Urquhart, here played by Sean Connery, supported by the Polish 1st Paratroop Brigade, commanded by General Sosabowski, here played amazingly by Gene Hackman, are tasked with the capture of Arnhem and Oosterbeek. Although Sosabowski has concerns, because the drop sites are quite a long distance from the objectives, and there isn't enough resources to drop all the troops in one go, but over a period of 3 days, thereby eliminating the element of surprise. As the plan is progressed, we are then shown intelligence being received that the German forces are in fact being strengthened in Holland, to the concern of British intelligence, but this is dismissed out of hand by Browning. This part did happen kind of in real life, whereby there was intelligence gained by the Dutch resistance alongside RAF reconnaissance flights that suggested the German forces were indeed far stronger than initially anticipated. And this was a considered and calculated risk for operational success, due to the nature of the attack coming from the air, ergo surprise, but it was also considered to be necessary due to the V2 sites and the requirement of their destruction. And if that the destruction of those sites, along with a concentrated push into the northern area, this could indeed break the back of the German forces in occupied Europe, thereby allowing the Allies to push into Germany sooner rather than later. Off we then trot to 30 Corps, the British tank division led by General Horrocks, played brilliantly by Edward Fox, where he is briefing his commanders on the operation, with the focus obviously on the ground assault part, mainly Garden, which apparently follows accurately the manner in which Horrocks did actually brief his troops in real life. The operation then starts and we see the build-up of the airborne forces at their various locations in England, where they are then flown in a huge fleet of various aircraft and gliders to their drop sites in Holland. There's some amazing cinematography played out here, whereby we're giving a point of view look of a paratrooper as they exit the aircraft all the way to the ground, allowing us, the viewer, to almost experience what that would be like. We then switch back to the ground assault, this time focusing on Lieutenant Colonel Van der Leur, played brilliantly by Michael Caine, as the commander of the Irish Guards, whilst they try and push through the German lines, but meet with some resistance. Back with the airborne assault, we see the various US and British units land and secure their drop zones completely unhindered, although they do eventually face some issues. The 82nd is badly mauled, although we don't actually see that battle, but we get to follow Sergeant Eddie Doohan, played by James Caan. This is a fictional composite character based on the real-life persona of Charles Doohan, as he retrieves his captain who was seriously injured and presumably dead on the battlefield. We then follow Colonel Stout, played by Elliot Gould, another fictional and condensed character based on the real-life Colonel Sink, the commanding officer of the 101st 506th, as they try and take the Somme Bridge, but it's destroyed. We then see Lieutenant Colonel Frost, the CEO of 2 Para, played brilliantly by Anthony Hopkins, easily take positions inside Arnhem, but then failing to capture the bridge on their first assault. And we then move to General Urquhart at his Oostbeek landing zone, experiencing issues with radios and lack of resources. All these issues being shown to highlight the impending doom of the operation and that the Allied forces will face a much tougher battle than they actually expected. As per real life, we then see the US forces, both the 82nd and the 101st, take the bridges assigned to them, albeit with a very nail-biting Rhine crossing assault by the 504 PIR 82nd Division led by Major Cook, a real-life person played here by Robert Redford, on the Nijmegen Bridge, along with the German failure to blow up the bridge. However, the main focus for the remainder of the movie is the dire situation faced by the British and the Polish airborne troops around Oostbeek and Arnhem, where they face the fanatical, well-equipped and highly trained SS troops led by Dietrich, played here by Maximilian Schell. The SS forces of the 2nd SS Division slowly but surely squeezes Frost's small and under-equipped 2 Para in Arnhem, eventually forcing their surrender. At the same time, we see, albeit with little detail, the dire situation faced by Urquhart at Oostbeek, where the British troops are hemmed in and surrounded by the Germans, and they too are eventually squeezed into a tight pocket. Finally, we are shown the British troops at Oostbeek finally being forced to retreat over the Rhine, leaving Frost's 2nd Para to its fate in Arnhem. The bulk of the British troops do manage their retreat over the Rhine to safety, thanks to the combined effort of Polish and US troops. We are then taken to the commanding generals Browning and Urquhart, Gavin Horrocks, Sosabowski and Maxwell Taylor, reflecting on what went wrong. Browning exclaims the operation was a partial success, something the Allies did in fact claim in real life, and that the operation was always a bridge too far. The movie then closes with a real-life depiction of Kate de Horst, a Dutch civilian who tended for Allied wounded at her house, taking with her what little belongings she can muster and fleeing, with one of her children marching at the back along a Dutch dike with a broomstick acting as a gun. Whilst A Bridge Too Far isn't 100% accurate, it is quite a true reflection of what actually happened in that fateful operation. It is normal to condense factual events, combine real-life people into composite characters, and employ some kind of artistic license in order to make the film well-paced and entertaining to watch. If such things weren't done, then we would have a convoluted movie that would be rather disjointed and with even more characters. Obviously, there are contemporary reports on this battle, but these reports are generally militaristic in their nature and never really accurately reflect what was actually said or what was really done. For example, it is correct that the German forces found the entire battle plans relating to the operation, but we will never really know for sure what Modell's actual reaction to that was. Nor will we ever truly know if Modell was so conceited to really believe that he thought the Allies were merely coming to capture him. We do know Modell was a highly capable and efficient officer whose confidence had been severely dented by his failure in Normandy, but hardly to this extent and to the point where he was so conceited as depicted in this movie. However, Germans are to an extent needed to be shown as the bad guy, and Modell therefore is that target. Oddly, however, Dietrich, who was the SS general, is portrayed as a kind and emphatic leader, and his actions during the real-life operation are correctly depicted. He did indeed order a ceasefire to allow Allied troops to tend for the wounded, and he also ordered that those troops who surrendered in Arnhem should be cared for. Some of the depictions of the Allied officers, however, are also slightly off. Browning never really had a devil-may-care attitude as portrayed in the film. He was actually quite a capable officer and a stickler for following orders. Here, however, he is shown as a person who really doesn't care about the troops under his command, despite knowing that they will face greater resistance than anticipated. Browning always knew, along with the entire Allied command, Eisenhower included, this was a risky operation with a very uncertain outcome, but it was considered necessary with the risks fully calculated. Sosabowski is portrayed as a cynical and abrupt leader, which is certainly not the case in real life. He was actually all for the operation and even suggested to Horrocks that the battle could be successful despite the initial setbacks if he was given permission to attack the German positions on the Rhine with his Polish forces, which was actually denied. Shortly after the battle, Montgomery wrote a letter to Sosabowski praising the Polish forces' bravery. Nevertheless, Monty also wrote another letter, this time only to the British High Command, roughly about 2 weeks later, blaming the failure of the entire operation on the Polish forces, using them as a scapegoat, forcing both the removal of Sosabowski from his command and allowing Churchill to pressure the Polish government in exile to accept Stalin's overtures relating to Poland at the end of the war. Sosabowski's reputation, therefore, was quite tarnished, and this seems to come across in the movie, albeit unfairly. Whilst A Bridge Too Far is a very well-intended movie, which really doesn't venture too far from the real-life events, the film itself tries too hard to capture too much, and with that it fails to capture some of the more significant parts of the actual operation. Little to barely no screen time is given to the vitally important battle carried out by the US forces at Eindhoven and at the Somme, which in real life was a very hard-fought battle indeed, with the Germans bringing in Panther tanks to destroy the bridge at the Somme, something we do not see in the movie, and also the Luftwaffe being engaged to bomb the US forces in Eindhoven, effectively reducing the city to ruins. Also, the plight of the troops in Oosterbeek is kind of overshadowed, with the film intending to focus on Frost's forces inside Arnhem itself. Again, this is done for pacing, and it would have been difficult to show in any meaningful way the numerous battles that occurred during this operation. I mean, there were effectively 7 different fronts, all happening at the same time, spread over a very wide area. The film also fails to make any mention whatsoever of the V2 sites, a major factor in the planning of Market Garden, and therefore suggests that it was merely about ending the war quickly. Market Garden was more than that, And this very important factor is totally ignored. And it tends to make the film suggest that the entire operation was fatally flawed before it even began, which is really an unfair reflection of the planning of this operation. Again, this was done for pacing and, no doubt, artistic license, in order to avoid an even longer movie with even more subplots. One thing, however, this movie does get right is the fact that the operation was a total disaster for the Allies. The movie doesn't try to hide the fact this was a risky operation, although in some respects it goes a little bit too far with suggesting it was always going to fail from the very beginning, and Browning had this "I don't really care" attitude. The movie doesn't suggest the Allies are in some way invincible and the Germans are inept, which a lot of war movies do kind of suggest, especially those movies made either during or just after the war, for obvious reasons. With the exception of Modal, the Germans are depicted as a formidable force, which is exactly what they were. They were competent, intelligent, and resourceful. It would have been so easy to demonise them, and Attenborough does well to resist that temptation, and he fails to do it, and quite rightly so. Yes, there is some arrogance shown, but in many instances this is shown completely within context. Again, with the exception of Modal. Beatrix himself is given a human face instead of the stereotypical SS monster that we are generally given. In all, A Bridge Too Far is a flawed movie, both historically and in other respects, but these flaws actually help it rather than hinder it. The flaws are there because without them the movie would be like 10 hours long, difficult to tell a meaningful and interesting story, and would only give us bland military leaders who are just doing their duty. What we get instead is a movie that tries its very best to tell a very true and very poignant story of an operation for the Allies that was disastrous, and it does so in a respectful and honest way. No one is seen as being better than the other, there is no romantic overtures towards soldiering or war, and there is certainly no propaganda being forced upon us. What we do get is the harrowing story of an operation that was very risky, overly rushed, and overly confident, and the film in that respect doesn't venture too far from that. Film critics, however, blasted this movie as an overindulgence, which I think is quite unfair. Yes, there is a star-studded ensemble, and yes, there is a series of routine battles and exercises. But the idea of movies like this, or any type of movie that is actually based on real-life events, is there to try and tell the story in a way that is engaging to the audience. And I think this film does that. Without this film and films like it, how many of us would actually know about such things as Operation Market Garden? Sometimes critics, in my opinion, focus on the artistic side far too much, instead of looking at what the movie's message is actually trying to convey. And I think that does a disservice to movies such as this. I, for one, like this film. It may be flawed, but it tells the story of the real-life people facing real-life sacrifices in a war that was truly horrific. And it does so with dignity and with an eye on the truth. That to me means a lot. And whilst the film is flawed, it's not that flawed or so flawed to push an agenda or a message that is completely BS. Anyway, I've been Fujit. I hope you enjoyed my take on the movie A Bridge Too Far. By all means, comment on everything below. And I hope to see you again next time. Until then, bye for now.